one thing that men get confused on is anger and sadness, and like vulnerability is another one. So I think that if you were maybe mining for lithium, or you just accidentally started mining for vulnerability in men, I think that if you tapped into all the quote unquote angry guys, you might find a pretty good amount of that there. I think in the past for myself, I always was a little bit angry, but didn't know it after my parents got divorced and went through that whole struggle. I definitely got around a therapist or two, but they all said, this kid's not ready to open up,
Hmm.
and they could have kept knocking for 30 years. It wouldn't have happened, you
Right.
know? And
Right.
so you realize something like that and how it may have had an effect, other things also peripherally, but I think the biggest element to that is probably anger, and then figuring out why you're angry, what you can do about it, what you shouldn't do about it, what you'd like to, all that stuff, and then
Mhm.
ask yourself why at the end of each.
Welcome to the Cardinal Way for Men. My name is Ed Cardinal, and this is the Next Man Up. And this is a transformational, candid conversation with men. And I'm really excited to be talking to Jake this evening. And I met Jake when I lived in Rhode Island, and he was actually a member of my men's yoga class. I taught a men's yoga class, guessing for about 3 to 4 years, and Jake was a member of that class. And I want to start there, Jake. I want to welcome, by the way, Jake. It's great to see you. It's been a while.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me.
You're
I'd
welcome.
never been interviewed before.
Well, there's always a first time. It'll be just like a conversation that we've had after a yoga class. That's one of the things I really appreciated about our talks. Usually after a yoga class was your perspective on life, and I thought you'd be a great uh, guest on Next Man Up because you always had a refreshing way of looking at things. And why did you get involved in a men's yoga class? Why like a men's yoga class and not like a regular mixed yoga class?
I'd certainly gone to mixed yoga classes,
Mhm.
but you came up for a few different reasons. One was that it was approximately 1,000 feet from where I was staying at the time, I think,
That's right.
and it was also downhill to your door. So those were easy, right? But really, what it came down to was that I went there with my father-in-law,
Yeah.
and it was something for us to do together. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it was our reason for choosing it for men. For myself, it was mostly about hamstrings and things that I knew that I think men had more problems with than women, perhaps. We
Hmm.
carry all the weight up top, and we carry a lot of weird tension through our daily lives and our work. And I was no exception. Having done carpentry, my right side gets more built than my left, and the hamstrings just about never get worked out. You do ladders all day, then you go home, and for years I would just drink a few beers or whatever,
Hmm.
eat badly, and those are my younger years. And then it started to come around and realized that I had to make some kind of change as far as physicality, and then through the experience with you guys, started to kind of take hold mentally as well.
Hmm. Was there a deciding moment for you that you knew you had to make some changes?
Um, yeah, I think so. It became an injury prevention kind of thing for me. So really utilitarian in the beginning, um, and then I saw what it felt like to have you know open hips and loose hamstrings, and a lot of things take off from that point once you loosen up a bit. And I think
Mm.
that was really part of it for me was maybe stress and lack of hydration and everything else that you know we get fetched up on, or at least I did,
Hmm.
kind of brought me to that point. And there was no real defining moment of this is what I must do. It was just let's check this out.
Yeah. Now you said you got more out of it than just the physical component of yoga. You opened up parts of your body, your hamstrings, your hips. Was there other parts of you that opened up besides the
Uh,
physical body?
Definitely breathing, and also like the sacrum kind of movement, and also the spinal stuff were all really good. I mean, that's, I guess, part of our nervous system,
Hmm.
well connected to the brain, and so also connected to the ground, it's whatever situation. So that was all kind of telling for me as far as alignment and all that.
Mm. And how was it being in a yoga class with all men? Was there a feeling of camaraderie? Was there, we were together for probably 3 years. We started with men that had no experience in Purna yoga, which is the yoga that I teach, and we kind of stuck together through those 3 years. So there was like that there was that commonality, the camaraderie, and the sort of learning together about Purna yoga. Um, so did you get a sense of that? I mean, you were in there, as you said, with your father-in-law, and
Yeah,
that was a nice way to spend some time with him. Great
right.
man, by the way. And so, did you get a sense of some of that connection with the other men in the class?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I learned a lot from everybody and had a good time. I think in general, I haven't been to like a lot of mixed classes, co-ed or what have you, and I'm sure the camaraderie and the ability to have a good laugh here and there, even in the middle of the session, is all there completely. But yeah, there was definitely camaraderie there. I ended up doing some work with Noah in carpentry, who was the younger member, and
Mm-hmm.
very wise young person. He had an older father who was absolutely legendary, just judging by Noah. I mean,
Hmm.
he did things. We're also trained in carpentry by a guy who was 70 plus, and so um, before I asked him if he wanted to do any work with me, I told him to certainly get all the knowledge from the guy that he was working with, because that old vine stuff doesn't stick around forever.
No, particularly in our culture, that's yeah, that's a kind of a dying like that apprenticeship, mentorship is such a great way to learn. So as you said, if you can get a hold of someone that can teach you, it's priceless. And then
Yeah.
and you bring up a great point about that yoga class. We had such a mixed age group. We had a young man who was Noah's nephew or cousin or uncle or I don't know. I can't remember how that worked out. Like you said, he had an older father. So, but he was in college. Then we had Noah, who was also, I think, probably late 20s, and then into 40s, 50s, and even 60s. So it was nice to have that diverse age group. How did you first get introduced to yoga? You were mentioned before we started this interview. I think you said a stepfather.
No.
Mhm.
My first, I think, introduction to it, or rationalization for trying it someday, was through snowboarding.
Okay.
There were a lot of pros that were adopting it in the late 90s, or probably mid 90s, even
Mhm.
perhaps earlier. But they all swore by it, and it does work for that.
Mhm.
There's a lot of positions you get into where you have to kind of cross up laterally, and
Mhm.
open hips are going to definitely give you way
Mhm.
greater control, and you know all the power and that goes with it. But I guess more recently, um, two places really. It was I live somewhat close to All That Matters, which is our
Mhm.
kind of local yoga hub,
Mhm.
in the area, or at least it had been. And I had gone there, and my friends, long, long time ago, a friend of mine dated the daughter of the owner of that, and they seemed like really great folks. So
Mhm.
it's just kind of a something I was never fearful of doing, or felt out of place doing, because I had contacts in multiple places, and for checking it out.
Right, right. Awesome. So Jake, growing up, did you have a role model, a male role model that you tried to to emulate?
Yeah, I think my father and my grandfather
Mm,
equally probably on
mm,
some levels, especially when young, because I spent weekends with my grandparents, and they're just always a good time and really kind of doting, not to the sense of like spoiling or anything like that, but they were super nice and comforting. And then my dad's brother actually is who's still with us,
okay.
is who I went to see in Florida. He had worked in the Peace Corps since, well, he was, I think, 1964 when it started until like 2009 or a little bit later, actually. And he continued his career doing ESL, teaching ESL
Hmm.
abroad. And he spent a lot of his career also at SIT, which is School for International Training in Vermont, also known as the Experiment. And I don't think it's in Brattleboro. I think it's just north of there, but really good guy and absolute joker, always telling bad jokes, trying to create jokes where none should exist. That thing, but yeah, very influential. And so it's funny too, those three guys
Mm,
kind of encapsulate a lot of the career choices that guys have made in my family, which is military, academic, or construction, or
mhm,
contracting, as it were. But
mm.
yeah, it's kind of interesting there. My grandfather had been a World War II vet, so he wasn't a military man. He ended up as a mail carrier, but
Mhm.
he would still sneak into Fenway wearing his mail uniform. So I guess that counts for something.
And what would you say were some of the main things that you learned from them as far as being a man?
Wait, I should also give honorable mention to my dad's best friend, who was really instrumental as a role model, and also my kind of stepfather, my mom's boyfriend for 20 years before he passed. Those two were huge.
Yeah.
But yeah, as far as the first three and the latter two, um, my grandfather was just kind of a larger than life character. He was legally blind, and he was just a real character, as about as charismatic as they come for not being somebody who's famous, I guess,
Right,
and just
right.
real interesting guy. And he had been raised in the north end of Providence as a Protestant in an era where it was not good to be non-Catholic in Providence, no matter what. And so the section he lived in was full of Italians, and he had dark brown hair and brown eyes, so he looked Italian, even though he was French. And the Italian guys brought him under their wing, and so he kind of acted like an Italian, which was funny. It wasn't obnoxious or anything like that, but he would frequently curse in Italian and this and that, and so that he was just a character.
Mm.
My dad, I'm sorry, did you ask about experiences?
Well, just how they influence you as a man. What sort of lessons did you learn from them about what it means to be a man?
All right, yeah, I'll pare that down a little better. My grandfather was very resolute World War II. So I wouldn't say stiff upper lip because he was a complete clown as far as like being a joker and stuff. But he was always the boys don't cry kind of guy. If I
Yeah. Yeah.
spilled my coffee milk or whatever and I busted out crying, he would absolutely try to squash that.
Yes. Yeah.
And my dad was way more as a maybe a result of that, more new age. And he was, I think, 21 in the summer of 67, so he caught that osmosis style. But
Hmm.
he was very much instrumental in helping me kind of control my anger, and also know when to be assertive and stand up for yourself, and really kind of showed me how to exercise caution when it was necessary, especially in the midst of getting carried away. So
Hmm.
there was a lot that I owe to him as far as that
Hmm.
ability to navigate. Um, my uncle was the eye opener on some levels for looking outside our own borders, as far as looking to, telling me stories about the rest of the world, sending postcards, that kind of thing. So having somebody you look up to that's not geographically in one place all the time is always interesting if they have good stories to tell, which he always did and
Right.
does.
Right.
Um, my father's best friend had been a Green Beret in the Vietnam era, and he didn't go to Vietnam because he did what they call a dine and ditch the night before he was, I guess, getting his graduated, whatever ceremony they do there. And so they kept him stateside, and he became an instructor. And he was just a very good teacher, which I think is a prerequisite for being a Green Beret. You have to really connect with people and, basically help build them up, if you will. And he was really good about that. And he ended up living in the woods in Vermont, almost completely off the grid. I think they had power and stuff, but he could easily make it without it. He farmed on 40 acres, and he bought a place with 88. And he worked Belgian horses for all the needs. He never had a tractor; he used all horses. And his first house he built with a chainsaw mill. Built a house and barn with a chainsaw mill in the mid 70s or early 70s. And he was a complete wild man, but you'd never know it if you had just met him. He was very calm and centered, and I think he might have come by it naturally.
Mm.
His motto was, "When in doubt, eat." So that's how he rolled. And then
It sounds like uh, what you're describing so far, and then we'll get to your what you called who you called your stepfather. Self-reliant men who are strong, self-reliant men, but also worldly, like
yeah,
I think you said your dad's best friend in the Peace Corps, and there's something to be said about traveling around the world and being exposed to that, because you get to get a different perspective. And you,
right, yeah, that would be my dad's brother. And
oh, your
yeah,
dad's brother.
especially
Okay.
since he was family, that was a big one, because somebody you look up to and that's related to you
Right.
kind of gives you the idea, hey, I could probably do something like that because it's been done before. The path's blazed for you, kind of.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And lastly, and most men that I talk to don't have as many men around them like you did, as someone to look up to as role models. I just want you to know that you're pretty lucky to have had those men in your life, and I'm sure you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I mean, even if they're not full-time, coaches, if you
Right.
will, recognition of it and realizing that you had some great interactions is key, and feeling satisfied or content.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have to mention my mom's boyfriend, Paul. He was a really, really good guy. I think he was
Mm-hmm.
born in 36, so he was on the older side. I think he was about 18 years older than my mom when they started dating. And he had been a commercial fisherman for years. He owned a few boats. He was one of the first freezer fishing boats off on the East Coast, figuring out refrigeration on board and all that kind of stuff. He had a couple friends who were kind of instrumental in that as well. He went to URI for marine affairs, but he had gone also to UPenn before that for metallurgy. So he was a bright guy. His father was a director of soap operas in New York,
Hmm.
and I forget what years, but he's definitely on IMDb or Wikipedia. Directed The Guiding Light and a couple of others, and so this character Paul had all kinds of experiences in New York City. He would see Moondog frequently, the blind composer who was, I think, the Viking of Seventh Avenue or something like that. He met Frank Costello in either a bar or a diner or something like that, and his father walked in and yanked him out by his shirt collar and asked him if he knew who that man was, and never to talk to him again and all that. So he saw somebody that not many of us have seen,
Hmm.
uh, and also had I would say a pretty good amount of culture, even though he sort of rejected it all, defiantly. That's what made him fun. He
Hmm.
could tell you the roots of certain words because he was so well read and well versed. He could tell you the origins of machinery as well.
Hmm.
So yeah, he's a very super interesting guy.
Hmm.
Really smart, but also had to manage commercial fishermen, deckhands. So he had to also level with the lower register, if you will,
Yeah, yeah,
not to diminish anyone's contributions.
right,
Everybody something to the table.
right. So how have these men shaped your life? How do you your life philosophy, the way you conduct yourself in your life, how has it
Hmm.
influenced you? So what is your philosophy of life? How do you try to lead your life?
Well, most recently, I've just been trying to stay organized and focused on what I can do versus what needs to be, delayed or put off. And so right now, I'm trying to pace myself and kind of order my life a little more than I had in the past. I think in the past, I'm 47 now. I think I'm kind of coming around in my mid 40s to what would be a more, I guess, predictable existence. Before that, I was always flying by the seat of my pants, had no real philosophy, and didn't really ever adhere to any structure or any of that. So I just kind of jumped around and did what I wanted because I always had carpentry, which my dad taught me. So my career was a little bit, I bounced around between a lot of different jobs and got high up in the fish industry, believe it or not, after commercial fishing. And I ended up as a bluefin tuna buyer, kind of traveling around, sampling fish and putting prices on fish on the dock and sending them to Japan and getting them from Europe and sending them to the States, all that kind of thing, just
Hmm.
almost commodities type stuff. But
Yeah,
it's a perishable instead of a commodity. So
right,
not only are you buying raw material, but it's also actively spoiling
right,
as it travels. So
right.
um, that was that wasn't possible without the background that I had and the ability to, I guess maybe stay calm under pressure, which sounds kind of cowboy like, but there is truth to it. Too much of it will harm you, but yeah, there's that was huge. I couldn't have done that without Paul and the rest of the gang.
Hmm. And you had mentioned before we started this interview that you recently went on vacation and some of the things you learned about the way you've been leading your life, and maybe you'd like to maybe share a little bit more about that because I think it's important for men to hear because it's something that a lot of men struggle with.
Yeah,
Yeah.
uh, I always thought um, for a long time, in many reasons, that there was never a problem that I couldn't outwork, and there comes a point where you receive one that you can't outwork, whether it be health, finance, any of those things. It could be something else that I've missed entirely, but definitely those were two that hit me pretty hard. Um, just in the sense that, wow, I didn't see that coming, and I can't quite outwork this, at least not in a week or two. And so that definitely spun me a bit for sure.
Mhm.
Those that type of thing.
Yeah. And when you were on vacation, what came to you?
Um, through the process of what I just mentioned, I kind of lost the ability to relax, if you will, and I didn't realize it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you deprive yourself of the ability to relax, you're kind of, I guess, losing a big part of yourself. You know, thoughts become constrained, and you kind of just your brain runs out of gas.
Mm-hmm.
And I never really, quote unquote, recharged to that extent, especially not, as you get older, hopefully wiser. And so it was like being gifted a new brain almost.
Yeah, it's amazing what happens if you when you sort of unplug from
Yeah.
what like you did for a week or so and unplug from work and let yourself relax, let your nervous system unwind, and you start to think a little more clearly. And I'm thinking that when you came back that you might be leading your life a little bit differently. Would you agree?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it definitely did. Um, and I got to say, the other huge component to that unplugging was also being around friends and family and friends
Hmm.
of my family, breaking bread with that kind of a group on almost nightly basis is another huge thing that kind of put me on the right track as far as calibrating. But when I came back, I had a half a glass of wine with my mother and my wife, and a week later, I had another half a glass of wine on the Friday night, and that was came back on February 19th. I'm sorry, January 19th, and yeah, we're Valentine's Day tomorrow, so it's almost been a month, and I've had a glass of wine,
Hmm.
you know, maybe less,
Yeah.
and that's been huge for me because um, I was probably around 3 to 6 drinks a week average.
Hmm.
Some weeks there'd be zero, some weeks there'd be 10, but I think that that's safe to say that I was a 3 to 6 drink per week type of consumer.
Hmm.
I guess emphasis on the three, but who knows? It's all randomized depending on what's going on.
Right.
Um, but that was huge for me just to kind of cut that back,
Right. Right.
thinking about alcohol in terms of I should probably put that on the calendar and plan to, have a good time with alcohol as opposed to just making it like a sports drink almost.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. How about you mentioned health? How is your health, and what do you do to take care of yourself?
I didn't have a GP for a long, long time. I was paying health insurance for myself because of the 2014 penalty that they imposed. So I never wanted to pay the penalty, but it took me a good several years to actually get to the doctor. So really, in a nutshell, just paying attention, making sure that I get my annual, get blood work. At 45, I guess, I had, scheduled the colonoscopy because Blue Cross will cover it at 45 as opposed to 50.
Hmm.
And kind of taking a more active role, or what you might call a normal role of looking after my health. And that,
Right.
that was big,
Awesome.
got some blood pressure in check. And I think the cholesterol is good. I'm actually due for another round of blood work here soon for my annual. So we'll find out. But been eating better as a result. And
Awesome.
the past month or two looked into, how to get fiber and protein at the same time. So doing some bean research.
Good for you. I know one thing that you were working on too before I left Rhode Island, it was hydration. We were trying to do better with that. How has that been going for you?
Well, I get around the water faucet often enough, and I'm starting to just, drink from it more often.
Hmm.
Just it's, that is an easy method. Another method I've employed is to drink a glass of water in the beginning of the day and one at the end.
Yeah,
That also works good. So
perfect.
I'll use a different method depending on the day. I don't really have a set way of doing it, but
Uh-huh. Yeah,
definitely just keeping it in my head instead of keeping it in a bottle at all times.
right. How about, I know one thing you were sort of experimenting with too was electrolytes, adding some electrolytes to your water. Is that something, a habit that you continued or no?
Here and there, I mean,
Yeah.
if we have packets, I'll use them for
Right.
sure.
Yeah.
They are on the list right now to get, and I
Yeah.
think that we're kind of deciding which one we want to stock up on.
Right.
But I like the Ultimate is awesome.
Right.
I might just opt for that or lobby for it.
Yeah. 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 One other question before we close out here, and again, I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to join Next Man Up.
I have time for three more.
Okay. That's the other thing. I always appreciated your sense of humor, and now I know why. You've had some pretty amazing characters in your life that you probably it probably rubbed off on you, but it's part of that's your personality, anyways. So I appreciate that.
It goes deeper, but we can always have a second interview.
We will. We will. Have you had any challenges that you've come up against in your life? And if you have, all of us do, but one in particular that kind of jumps out at you when I ask this question, and how did you overcome it, or are you in the process of overcoming it?
Yeah, I think sorting out emotions um, has been a big thing of not a breakthrough, but definitely a part of feeling better and having the ability to calm down and actually pilot the craft a little better. realizing that you've got limitations and checking into what they might be. And um, I've thought recently that I think one thing that men get confused on is anger and sadness, and uh, like vulnerability is another one. So I think that if you were maybe mining for lithium, or you just accidentally started mining for vulnerability in men, I think that if you tapped into all the quote unquote angry guys, you might find, a pretty good amount of that there. I think in the past for myself, I always was a little bit angry, but didn't know it after my parents got divorced and went through that whole struggle. I definitely got around a therapist or two, but they all said, this kid's not ready to open up.
Hmm.
And they could have kept knocking for 30 years. It wouldn't have happened, you
Right.
know. And
Right.
so you realize something like that and how it may have had an effect, other things also peripherally. But I think the biggest element to that is probably anger, and then figuring out why you're angry, what you can do about it, what you shouldn't do about it, what you'd like to, all that stuff. And then,
Hmm.
ask yourself why at the end of each of those.
Hmm.
Uh, yes, that's a big one. I think that's a big one, is kind of overcoming that. And, you know, the better job you can do of getting into it and degriefing yourself is, it's only going to be, uh, giving you, a little bit of mobility towards where you really want to get.
Mm. So what did you find that sadness and grief was sort of underneath the anger?
Oh yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I mean it's on a level of you know I would say gross non-examination. In retrospect, yeah, probably. Yeah,
Mm.
I
Yeah.
would say um, because you know there was really not much to be angry about, but the way that we've been programmed to process doesn't really allow for a complete unpacking of anything. You
No, it
know,
doesn't. No. That's a great way to phrase it, Jake. Yeah, we the way we've been taught or conditioned doesn't allow us to, I like that, unpack it.
yeah,
For a lot of men, what is more acceptable is anger.
yeah.
And it's usually comes out in unhealthy ways.
Yeah, well, I don't know too many ways that I've ever dispatched it that were great.
Yeah. And it also sounds like you brought up a great word in term vulnerability. And it sounds like to me that in order to get to the sadness and the grief that's underneath the anger, you have to be vulnerable. And it sounds like that's something that you were able to do.
Yeah, it's a tool.
Yeah.
Without you just kind of putting it that way, yeah, I just realized that's what that is.
Hmm.
We view it as this predator that actually has a section of them that's indeed prey, but that can be leveraged towards your goals if you can
Hmm.
discover it.
Yeah. And unfortunately, like we discussed other emotions that are acceptable and unacceptable for men, vulnerability is one of those that is generally not acceptable for men because it's seen as a sign of weakness. And in fact, I like what you said. It's a great tool. It's a great
Yeah.
tool to access, cut through, and to help unpack, like you said. So great insight. I appreciate that, and I think that will be helpful for a lot of men because a lot of men struggle with that.
One more thing I thought about that sort of travels the same way is like I always would have crossroads in my career or my thinking, and never really had great solutions for any of it besides the experience, afterwards. But I would always have these quote unquote existential moments or whatever. And I kind of thought about the root of that word, and how the heck can you have an existential moment? Isn't this whole ride existential, right? If it's your existence. And so I just kind of thought about that. Like, that's kind of bizarre. Like, you see a war movie, maybe, let's say, and there's one scene where the enemy and the main character like have a common moment, and that's I guess the existential moment of the film, and that's really the only part where most everybody feels good about what's going on the screen, and so yeah, we don't allow ourselves those times to be telling or investigative.
Mm. See, what you just said is what I most enjoyed about our conversations after yoga class is the depth of your expression, the depth of who you are is just I really enjoyed that in you and still do. You just reminded me of it. So thank
Thanks, Ed. I'll
thank
see if
you.
I can do it again tomorrow.
All right, again, thanks, Jake. I appreciate you joining Expand Up, and I'm sure it will be helpful for a lot of men. And if you enjoyed this video, please check out uh, the video posted here on men and emotions.